When I was reflecting on the readings during the week, there's a little moment from the first reading that jumped out at me. The context for the moment is that the apostles, after Jesus' resurrection, have been talking about everything that's gone on, and they've been proclaiming the gospel. They've been sharing it very publicly about what they've experienced, and that's got them into trouble with the Jewish authorities. And so in the story today, they're before the Sanhedrin. They get interrogated, and ultimately they get left alone for the time being. They were told not to speak, and they're released. The line that really jumped out at me is this line, the very last line of the reading. And so they left the presence of the Sanhedrin, glad to have had the honouring of suffering humiliation for the sake of the name. So they leave the authorities, glad to have had the honour of suffering humiliation for the sake of the name. What really jumped out at me was, I was thinking about that response, right? They're glad to have had the honour. So they've been humiliated, we're told. It was a shaming kind of thing to be dragged before the Sanhedrin. It would have been something that most of us, I think, would have cringed about. Can you imagine if the local government effectively comes in and says, right, you've been a friend of this guy Jesus and you've talked about him too much, come with me. Interrogated, quite a public thing. We think about that happening behind closed doors. That's not how it worked. That's what people would have known that had taken place. And we're told that they're glad that they suffered this humiliation. How glad would you or I have been? How glad would we have been? I guess the question that prompted within me is, what must it be like? What was going on inside of these men that they actually find it a joy, a gladness to have stood witness for Jesus, even though it would cost them their public reputations in this moment, and later will cost them their lives? What is it that they've experienced? And obviously the obvious answer to that is that they've encountered the risen Jesus, that they've seen the risen Lord, that they know that the Jesus that they've followed and who has taught his sublime, beautiful teaching was not just a kind of a fraud or a well-meaning teacher who died and that was the end of it, but the one who is risen from the dead, and therefore they have started, as we heard in the reading, to call him Lord, the name that's reserved to God. What's going on inside of them that they could have that kind of reaction, that kind of response, that they're glad that this has happened? Well, maybe the gospel gives us some further insight into this moment, gives us a further way into understanding what's happened here, because I think it's a really crucial passage for our lives as followers of Jesus. To set the scene, they've experienced the resurrection, they've gone back to Galilee, and they're waiting. So Jesus has appeared a couple of times already, and they're waiting, they're not sure what's going to happen next. And so Peter, I love it when he says to the others, I'm going fishing. He's going back to what he knows. He's going back to what's familiar. They've had this incredible experience, but they're maybe a little bewildered and confused and not at all sure about what happens next. So he says, well, I'm going to go back to what I know. And I love the response of the other disciples. They say, we're in this too, we're coming as well. And off they go to join in the fishing expedition. I don't think there's any sense here that what they're doing is to somehow conjure up Jesus' presence. What they're doing is actually saying, well, we've got no idea what to do next, so we're going to go back to what's comfortable and familiar and safe. Just says something really important to us about where we meet the risen Jesus. We meet the risen Jesus here when we come to Mass, but they're not in the temple in this story. They're not there in the place of worship that they were used to. Where they meet the risen Jesus in this moment is in their ordinary lives, in their regular, ordinary business, doing something that's familiar and safe. So one of the things that we might discover and experience is that the risen Jesus comes to be with us, that he, as it were, appears to us when we least expect it. The disciples are out fishing and they haven't caught anything. They see this figure on the shore. They don't realise it's Jesus. And then he calls out to them and says, have you caught anything? And he says, throw the net over the other side. So they get this big catch of fish. All of a sudden, the penny drops to the disciples and they say to themselves, Peter says, it's the Lord. The beloved disciple says, it's the Lord. John says, it's the Lord. Peter, we're told at that moment, who's wearing next to nothing, which is kind of normal, okay, as they're working away, hard work, comfortable. He does this thing to us that seems really curious. He puts a cloak on. Doesn't that sound strange? Given the fact, especially, that he's about to jump into the water and go swimming. Surely it makes sense to swim without too much pulling you down, right? Imagine if you're wearing something, picture, it's not quite the right image, but something like a toga. Imagine putting that on in order to jump into the water. Crazy thing to do on the face of it. But I think there's actually some really profound significance in that moment. Peter's been told it's Jesus, and the last time he saw Jesus, before the appearances, before those resurrection appearances, he denied him 3 times. And that's not been resolved yet. Jesus has appeared to Peter and the others, but this situation hasn't been fixed up. That the last time there was any kind of meaningful encounter, Peter denies that he even knows Jesus, and they have this moment of eye contact where they look at each other in that moment, and Peter goes and weeps bitterly. This is unresolved. And so the putting on of the cloak actually takes us all the way back to Genesis. Remember when Adam and Eve eat the fruit that they shouldn't eat? And they realize in that moment that they're naked. That in other words, they're no longer transparent to God. They're no longer able to look at God without fear or shame, or look at one another without that. And so they put the fig leaves on. They try and hide themselves. It's a profound symbol of what happens when we sin. We're no longer truly present, truly revealed to one another and to God. We need to hide ourselves in some way. So just as Adam and Eve have done that in the presence of God, so Peter's doing it now. He puts the cloak on in order to go to be with Jesus. Jesus doesn't say when he arrives, well, it's about time you showed up, we've got words to have. Notice at that moment he doesn't say, yeah, it's about time you came quickly to talk to me because we've got something to sort out. But how often do we do that? In those moments where we know we've got it wrong, in those moments where we know that we've hurt somebody, in those moments where we know we haven't been as faithful to God as we know deep down we should have been, there's this feeling like God's just waiting and he's saying, come on, hurry up and sort this out. I'm waiting for you. Get the words out. Say I'm sorry. Or we feel that sense of God's impending doom and judgment about to land on us. But notice Jesus doesn't do any of that. He actually says to Peter and the other disciples, it's time to have some food. Invites them to share a meal. It's only after the meal that Jesus draws Simon Peter aside and asks him, do you love me? Do you love me? And I don't think Peter gets it at first, right? Peter says, yeah, of course I love you. And Jesus says, feed my lambs. Second time, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Feed my sheep. Third time, feed my lambs. What's going on here? Well, we look at it and we go, well, Peter denied him 3 times, and now Jesus asks him, do you love me 3 times? Of course, it kind of marries up, doesn't it? I don't think he realised at the time, which is why he gets really impatient. Can you imagine how embarrassed he would have felt afterwards? He would have been thinking, oh, duh, of course that's what this is for. It's Jesus just inviting me to again say to him, do you love me? To restore the relationship that's been damaged by my betrayal, by my denial. So the question that the gospel puts before us so clearly today is, do you love me? Not sure how often you ask that question. Or better, let Jesus ask it of you. Do you love me? Do you love me? Truth is that Jesus does ask you that question. He asks me that question too. Do you love him? And in that moment, I think Peter's experiencing all the mercy of God. From the betrayal, from the denial that he does, where he pretends he doesn't even know him. The one who has done so much for him, the one who has walked with him every step of the way. when Peter does this, it's a shocking, terrible thing. Peter's overcome with guilt by it. And in that moment, and as he reflects upon it, he realizes that what Jesus is offering in that invitation is all of the mercy and forgiveness of God. That goes right to the very heart of the gospel. That Jesus, when confronted with something as deep as a betrayal of Peter's nature, doesn't condemn Peter, but shows him his mercy and compassion. When we experience that, when we know that, when we've encountered that kind of forgiveness, that explains why, like those first disciples, we can be willing, glad, to be a bit embarrassed, even humiliated perhaps, because we're a follower of Jesus. It's because we've tasted something that you can't find anywhere else. It's because we've experienced something that can't be found in any other context, that no other person can give, because only Jesus can offer and extend to us the mercy of God. That at our worst moment, we're loved. That at our worst moment, we're loved. At your worst moment, you're loved. That's why they're willing to suffer for the sake of the name. That's why they're glad to have been humiliated for the sake of the name, because they've experienced something extraordinary. Extraordinary. That's actually the birthplace of all ministry. Notice how Jesus then says, well, if you do love me, feed my sheep, care for those others, reach out to the flock, look after those who I've also called. That's the birthplace of all ministry. And here in the parish, what we really want to see is people recognizing that they've got a contribution. You know, when you've tasted the mercy of God, you want to respond in the way that Peter does by saying, okay, well, as best I can, I'm going to play my part in the caring for the other sheep. And so there are all sorts of ways to serve in our parish, all kinds of ways to minister. What we want for people is that they'd minister in accordance with where they're gifted, with the ways in which God has blessed and gifted them. But everybody's got a contribution to make according to those gifts and their capacity. So I want to invite you to reflect upon this and to think about it. Well, if I've glimpsed something of the mercy of God, how might I also now contribute? How might I also play my part in the feeding of the sheep? Because that's exactly what happens when we encounter the mercy of God in Jesus risen from the dead.